Welcome to the LifeBeat podcast, a One Joshua Group production, providing access to information and experts to improve quality of life and health outcomes.
Thank you for joining us. I'm Kermit, Payne, your host for LifeBeat. As always, we welcome you and thank you for participating in this, and most of all, sharing this podcast with your friends about our delightful host today. Our delightful guest today. I've already told her it's her show, so that's why I got to throw that off to her as being host. But I want to introduce you to someone. I want you to remember this name and take the opportunity to learn something very special today. We're joined today by Dr. Melissa Davis, and Dr. Davis is the director of the Institute for Translational Genomics and also with the Georgia Research Alliance as distinguished investigator. Dr. Davis, who is a professor in the Department of Microbiology, Biochemistry, and Immunology at Morehouse School of Medicine. Dr. Davis, thank you for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me.
Now, Dr. Davis has all these wonderful accolades, and we are honored with the fact that she has joined us. I want to share some of that with you. She received a PhD in molecular genetics at the University of Georgia. Go Georgia.
Go Dogs.
Where she completed groundbreaking work on developmental functions of steroid signaling in model organisms. Now, Dr. Davis is going to explain all this to us, so just sit tight and listen to this. She also completed some postdoctoral training at Yale School of Medicine and also at the University of Chicago in human genomics and the Institute of Genomics. Now, in addition to that training, she had postdoctorate training at the Cancer Health Disparities at the University of Chicago in the Interdisciplinary Center for Health Disparities. And here she led into her current trajectory of work to look at the biological determinants of cancer health disparities and how they intersect with marginalization of minoritized populations. She's published extensively in groundbreaking findings and gives us a new lens on the biological factors of cancer outcomes as they relate to genetics ancestry. Dr. Davis has an undergraduate degree from the Albany State University. Albany State University. And I want to share a story with Dr. Davis about that. Most recently, I was at the convocation at Morehouse School of Medicine, and a young lady was sitting beside me, and she told me that, I went to Albany State, and Dr. Davis, who is on faculty here at Morehouse School of Medicine, also went to Albany State. And I came to convocation today because I wanted to meet Dr. Davis. Now, Dr. Davis, I don't know her name, but I want to let you know that you have fans who have come to see you. So again, thank you so very much for joining us, and I look forward to our discussion later today.
Thank you. I really appreciate it.
So much of what you talk about and gives us an opportunity to take a look into biological factors and genetic ancestry, particularly around breast cancer, gynecological cancers, and prostate cancer, and the importance of including diverse populations in research and providers and patients to better understand tumor biology.
Yes, sir.
Can you please tell us what tumor biology is?
Absolutely. So I think the general audience, general population already has an understanding of what a tumor is, right? It's just a group of cells that have started to overgrow, right? They're in a place in your body and they've created sort of this, we'll call it a sphere, of cells growing. What we want to understand is not only those, cells that make up what we call the tumor, but also all of the things around that group of cells. So it could be sort of the tissue that makes up the organ that the tumor is in, your immune cells that are, actively invading that pocket of cells. And so as we look at sort of the composition of all the different cells and even some of the chemicals that your body is producing in an effort to to fight the growth of the tumor. We want to understand sort of what is let's call it a life force that's giving this tumor the ability to grow and even create pain and eventually potentially become cancer. Not all tumors are what we call malignant. Some tumors are benign, and it's just a clump of cells that have grown, right, that we could just excise and everything will be fine. But some tumors are malignant, and that means they have this sort of superpower to evade your immune system. And so we want to distinguish sort of what it is about those cells growing, in the organ space where we find them, and what around them are creating the environment that allows them to do that.
Well, that's a relief to know. I think that in the real world, we hear the word tumor and we automatically assume that it is malignant and that it is cancerous. So thank you for that clarification. That's very important for our audience. And you talked about some of the are there biological factors related to this tumor biology that may or may not be ancestral or genetic? And can you tell us some about the interplay between those?
Absolutely. Now, that's a big question. So I'm going to break it down into some parts, if you don't mind.
Great.
So our understanding of what we call a predisposition to get a cancerous tumor. So mostly what I focus on are malignant tumors, right? So these are the types of tumors that typically require more than just an excision. We would need to target something about that biology in order to stop those cells from spreading, for instance. The reason why we talk about this in the context of ancestry is very simple. It's become very complex as, academicians start to figure out how to use genetic ancestry and genetic background. But let me take you back to when I did my PhD. So my PhD was using Drosophila, so that model organism of fruit flies. One of the reasons we use model organisms is because we can control which flies mate with other flies. So that allows us to then control the genetic makeup of the flies. So then we can really dig deeper into how a gene interfaces with the environment or other genes in the genome, right? But for humans, we can't do that. So we have to find a different way of describing what the genetic background is. And there's a natural experiment in terms of, our lineage, our origins, our genetic background, which is basically, as we go back generation and generation, behind us, we are able to see lineages of relatedness. And that relatedness then harbors what we've basically inherited from our great grandfathers and mothers. So as we inherit those different types of genes, some of them will bring, specific traits like the type of hair we have, our eye color, but they also sometimes bring a predisposition because the gene version that our great ancestors had in that environment when they were born, had sort of an advantage to it. So there's a specific one that we study, and maybe we'll get into it, here later. But the reason why it's important is because there are subsets of the population that have this sort of relatedness from this ancestral lineage. And so that group of people will have that version of a gene. And so a key example of this is a BRCA variant, which is a breast cancer gene that everybody knows about. Well, historically, the way that gene was identified was by looking at family groups that were very large and had very clear health information about incidence of breast cancer for many generations. And so the scientists that were studying those families were able to watch sort of the transmission of that allele or that gene variant through every generation. And that's how they honed in on this position in the genome. And so by virtue of studying that family group, we know the predisposition gene in their genetic background, which happens to be Ashkenazi Jewish families, which is why now we see more of these BRCA variants in an Ashkenazi Jewish background. And in fact, if you look at the guidelines for genetic testing, simply identifying as an Ashkenazi Jewish woman automatically makes you eligible for genetic testing for breast cancer variants in BRCA. And the reason why now we are focusing or shifting our lens to the African American community and our African genetic background is because we also see, let's say, a higher incidence of a certain type of breast cancer that's also earlier onset. And that's a clue, right? So cancer tends to be a disease of old age, right? The older you are, the more likely you are to accumulate some mutation that creates a tumor. But for early onset, women getting cancer, breast cancer in their 20s and 30s, that tells us there's a genetic predisposition. And the fact that we see this enrichment in people who also share a genetic background of West African ancestry, that means that there's probably a genetic predisposition that we haven't been able to study the way we were able to study the Ashkenazi Jewish populations, because we don't have generations of annotated health data or genetic information to identify what that predisposition is. So we have to use other tools. So hopefully I addressed that.
Well, you warned us that there was a lot to unpack here.
Yeah,
So
I did.
thank you for unpacking some of it. And I hope
Yeah.
we'll get to address some of the other pieces. Now, I'm a prostate cancer survivor.
Wonderful.
So I read that these biological factors and genetic factors also have influence in the progression of not just breast cancer, but other gynecological cancers and prostate cancer, and particularly in diverse populations. How do we improve the knowledge base that you mentioned that's not present? How do we improve that to include more people who look like the lesser number of patients who are included, let's say, in studies, clinical trials, repository of specimens? What can we do to increase our knowledge about that base of people?
So I think, for one, we need to raise the awareness that there is a gap of knowledge. Like, for instance, for prostate cancer, maybe 5 years ago, it was considered what the field called a cold tumor, meaning they didn't see an immunological response, right? But then when they broadened their lens to start studying African Americans, and we clearly define that there is, this very strong, sometimes inflammatory aspect to the tumor progression, that tumor biology, that we've been discussing. It's clear that for some prostate cancer patients, particularly those who get it at an early age, do have a very strong immune response. That could even be targeted with immune therapies, right? And so that's a clear example of, first of all, let's change the scope of what we're studying, right? Like, we can't just study the convenience population, right? Like the set of people who come into the academic centers and then believe that when we just study this small group of people that we have a global understanding of a very complex natural history of how a tumor becomes malignant, becomes metastatic, and then takes someone's life, right? There has to be more information. So one of the things we are doing is also trying to raise awareness in the community, because the patient voice is very powerful. And so once we allow sort of the doors to be open and our communities know that the therapies and the standard of care that's currently available was really tailored to a completely different population, right? So we need your help. We need you to join us, in this sort of intellectual journey, so to speak, right? We need you to trust us. And it's hard, sometimes because of some of the atrocities that have happened in medical science to our populations. But, we need to be very transparent about the protections that we have in place and the necessity to ensure that all of these advancements are also benefiting our population. And so, I don't know, I think we take a two-pronged approach. First of all, we have to also educate clinicians that the standard of care that you're currently, doling out to everyone who walks in your door doesn't work for everyone who walks in your door. And then secondly, like I said, just really making sure we have a strong partnership with the patient community and that they become a part of the movement, so to speak, to address sort of these gaps that we have in our knowledge.
I want you to know I have a lot of questions, so I'll have
Yeah,
to
yeah.
limit my question. I'm curious. So
I'll
from
shorten my
from a
answers.
genetic no you from a genetic perspective, I've never had a chance to ask this question before. Maybe I've
Okay.
just not asked it. So from a genetic perspective, what are the probabilities that families where there is a historical prevalence of breast cancer may also have the same kind of prevalence of prostate cancer?
That's a great question. So we know that some of these cancer genes, as we call
Mhm.
them, are related to what we call molecular pathways
Mhm.
that tend to help us overcome things in the environment that have sort of damaged our DNA, right?
Mhm.
So whether it's from just UV, but sometimes it's pollution,
Mhm.
sometimes it's poor diet, other comorbidities. It literally can damage your DNA. And so that damage then is the catalyst to the mutations that then lead to cancer. So if you tend to see multiple types of cancer in every generation in a family, that is sort of a red flag that this family could be carrying what we call a cancer gene mutation that leads to multiple types of cancer. And we tend to also call those cancer syndrome genes. So
Mhm.
BRCA, for instance, is a cancer syndrome gene,
Mhm.
meaning if there's a BRCA variant in a family, you may see breast cancer, you may see a gynecological cancer, you may see prostate cancer.
Mhm.
And so it's rare that an early onset predisposition to cancer would just be one specific type of cancer. It's actually
Mhm.
very common that, because we see that when we do the tumor analysis,
Mhm.
that some of the most mutated genes, so we do this sort of analysis where we look at what are all the mutations in this
Mhm.
tumor and can we identify what the driver mutation was, so what caused this cancer. And when we look at that across the board, across all types of cancers, there's some key genes that always show up in every type of cancer. TP53 is
Mhm.
one, BRCA, of course, is one, RB1, which is retinoblastoma, is
Mhm.
another. And these pathways are usually related to something like DNA damage repair. So you've literally sort of lost the ability of a cell to repair its own DNA if you have a mutation in one of these genes. And if you have that sort of already in your genetic background, something you've inherited across, multiple generations,
Generations. Mhm.
then it's easier for you to get cancer because
Mhm.
it's more difficult for your cells to repair the DNA. So that's sort of where the predisposition comes from.
So from an awareness, when as a patient should I ask for genetic testing?
Absolutely. This is a very important question. A lot of people are asking this. And I think the flip side to this is, do I even want to ask for genetic testing? Right? That's the question I typically get. But I'll speak for myself as a scientist. I always want to know. And I think that's all sort of part of our culture as well. Like we want to know what all the dangers are
Mhm.
so that we can make informed decisions. So I would say if you are aware of more than one person in your family having
Mhm.
had a cancer diagnosis, and in your family, like we're talking, the algorithm is very complicated for clinicians. It's something like if it's two brothers or four cousins and a grandmother, and most people don't have that level of understanding across
Mhm.
all of their second cousins
They don't
twice
know.
removed. Right, right. They don't know.
Yeah, they don't know.
But if you know of more than
Mhm.
one in your close family, then I believe you should
Mhm.
consider, having a genetic
Mhm.
test.
So my father had prostate cancer. My father's father had prostate cancer. So when I was diagnosed and my PSA was very low, and my urologist says, "Well, we can just observe." Like we're not observing. I mean, I've got second generation. I'm third
Exactly.
generation. What am I going to observe? So
Exactly.
I am curious, though, as we talk about ancestry and onset. I know that we are seeing earlier onset of prostate cancer. Are we seeing the same kind of earlier onset for gynecological cancers and triple negative breast cancers? Are we seeing people diagnosed earlier?
Yeah. So, especially for triple negative breast cancer, the earlier diagnoses tend to cluster, in African Americans. But I will say that we don't have a monopoly on early onset triple
I'm
negative
sure.
cancer. But, again, that early onset seems to be pervasive. Like there's this trend generally in cancer where we're seeing a rise in younger people with cancer. Some of that, I believe, has more to do with the environment than the genetic predispositions that we've been talking about. And so a lot of the work that we do is trying to unravel what portion or what the level of influence might be from your genetic background versus the interaction of your genetic background with your environment. And hopefully we'll get into that more, as we continue our discussion. But for sure, the other caveat that we address is not only are the tumors in our African American community seeming to emerge at an earlier age, they're also much more aggressive, meaning they grow much faster than would the same diagnosis in a white counterpart. And we see that at a population level, which is also why it's so intriguing. And it's why we have sort of this rationale that we need to look for shared things across this population. Shared genetic ancestry is, of course, one, but we also have shared structural bias, in our society, right? We have shared overexposures to pollution. We have shared poor access to food and food insecurities. But the other parts of sort of the hidden, I like to say, hidden aspects of our environment are just our psychosocial health, our stress. The things that we don't really think of as biology in the tumor, but it is biological, right?
It's
So
biological.
yeah, your body responds to stress, and that response can impact your risk, to cancer. I like to tell people I'm allergic to drama. Stress causes cancer, so I'm quick to shut down drama, and this is sort of the way that I even talk to patients, like when people reach out to me after they have a cancer diagnosis and they say, well, what should I do? First thing I say is surround yourself with people who you love and trust and shed off anything that gives you any type of negative feeling at all and focus on love and support during this sort of transition of going from a cancer patient to a survivor, and then try to maintain that. But I think that there's something unique about our genetic background that harbors both resilience and predisposition to certain types of cancer biology. And I'm just really excited to be able to do this science right now. And I want to do it with the community because I think it can be transformative in so many different ways, not just about cancer, but the way we live and the decisions that we make.
So tell us about this really exciting part, this transformative opportunity to engage people who are affected by these circumstances. Tell us about some of the things you're doing, I'll say at the community level, at the end user level.
Okay.
Tell us about some of the programs that you are doing and the opportunities.
Right. So we have this global team, actually. And I'm going to start there and then come back to Atlanta.
Okay.
So we won a Cancer Grand Challenge Award, which is a team science award, which allows us to study cancer inequities in various different places around the world. And what's fascinating to me is the same types of tumors that we see in African Americans who live in Detroit and New York and Atlanta are the same types of the biological subtypes of cancer that we see in Nigeria and Ghana. And so that's another sort of aspect to understanding that there could be something in our lineage, in our genetic lineage. But when we go to Ghana, when we go to Nigeria, we also see an even stronger stigmatism or stigma that makes that diagnosis that much more difficult for men and women to manage in their culture. We see women who are isolated from their families, not allowed to even consume food because they have a cancer diagnosis, a gynecological, for instance, cancer diagnosis. They lose their identity. And that creates stress, which makes the disease even worse. And so what we try to put in place are support systems, even in West Africa, that allow us to create sort of this nurturing environment that we can even measure the biomarkers and see how social support helps improve survival, right? And so now let's bring that back to the United States. Now, while we don't necessarily see some of the trauma that is in West Africa, there's a different type of trauma happening here. Yeah. So the person who leads my Grand Challenge Social Determinants of Health team is a young professor at Emory University. Her name is Lauren McCullough. Now, Lauren studies social determinants of health in a very unique way. What she wants to understand is not what the typical studies have been showing about area level, from a helicopter view or a satellite view, the walkability of your neighborhood or the income of your neighborhood. We consider that. But what she also wants to consider is how Black women live their lives and what their lived experiences are just being Black women, wherever they are, regardless of their income, regardless of their education level. There are things about being a Black woman in America that lead to certain types of stress that are very unique to our population. And the data that compelled this sort of perspective was when she looked in Atlanta's sort of mortality rate in Black women, what she found was at the highest strata of socioeconomic status. So these are top earners, 1-2%, like where healthcare access is not a problem for these women. Screening is not a problem for these women. Even the type of cancer they were diagnosed with was earlier enough, diagnosed with standard of care available to them. They still have a higher mortality than white patients who live in poverty. So that's to say that it's not a socioeconomic status problem. It's not a health access. It might be a quality of care issue, but that quality of care is linked to a bias that's in a system that we have to navigate and create sort of this stress response, right? So, one of the things that she does, for instance, is a community advocate group called Bridge, and it's a group of women who are cancer survivors, and they create their own support group and their own support network. And as we do that, we also learn from them, what are the things you're concerned about? What are the things that, give you stress? And some of that might be a non-traditional sense of what social isolation feels like, being a high earner living in a well-to-do area doesn't necessarily mean you're surrounded by people
who support you,
who want you there.
Right.
Exactly. Yeah.
Yeah, I was going to tell you sound like my mother.
Oh.
My mom told me a couple of weeks ago, she turned and she asked me if I had cheerleaders, which is the same kind of social structure and support. And she said, Kermit, we all need cheerleaders, so we need to go out and find our cheerleaders.
Find your people.
And our people. And you know what? It really is deep. So I was listening to you like, that's really deep, because it is not something that just happened over a short period of time.
Right.
Why is there this relationship between African Americans in this country, and we hear about the relationship and the similarities in West Africa, but we don't hear that in about East Africa. We don't hear it about Northern Africa, not even in South Africa, talk about stress. So tell us about that relationship. I know that I understand it's ancestral, but tell us about the relationship of U.S. people, Black people, and West Africa. Why? What is that?
If we were to look at the composition, so it is ancestral, but more specifically, if we were to look at the composition of the origins of our African ancestry, the majority of our African ancestry is going to be West African. Now, I'll tell you that in our latest, well, not our latest study, but in one of our landmark papers where we measured the composition of genetic ancestry in African Americans who were from the Detroit area, the New York area, and Alabama. What we found when we looked at where the regional origin of that African ancestry was, is every region of Africa was represented in our background. So what does that say? There's a social history here that's embedded in our DNA where during the transatlantic slave trade, right, there were Africans that were stolen, whatever, forced migrated, whatever you want to call it, that came from all over Africa. And so
the big continent.
Yeah, exactly. And so alongside that, if we look at the sort of anthropological history of who our ancestors are, how we were coalesced in regions around the United States, we share a largest, composition of our genetic background from Africa with West Africans. Now, as far as other shared environments, that's some of the nuance that we want to uncover because, for instance, the food insecurities that people suffer here where they're, kind of forced to eat processed foods and things like that. While we don't necessarily see it as obviously in West Africa, there are strata even to their population where their food insecurity is different. It's more about the source of their food and whether it's refrigerated and, there are any number of, let's call it a different nuance to food security there, just as an example. But we also see the same types of psychosocial stressors, just being a caregiver, that tends to be more heavily weighed, in our populations across the whole diaspora, quite frankly. And then in East Africa, just for that contrast, as you asked me, the population we studied in East Africa for that same, landmark publication was Ethiopia. And in the Ethiopian population we studied, again, when we broke down their genetic composition, we found they had a huge amount of European admixture in their background, but specifically from Italy, right? So it was Italian admixture, which makes sense, again, if you look at their social history. And so that sort of admixture, as we call it, that profile of differences between East versus West and where the origin even of your European admixture comes from, all of that feeds into these molecular pathways that define that tumor biology. So having this global approach allows us to see how the genetic admixture in our background regulates those molecular pathways like DNA repair, stress response modulation, and then we feed into that algorithm. Now, where do they live, right? What are they exposed to? And then we feed more into that algorithm and ask, well, how are they living? What are the stresses that they endure? In Ethiopia, civil unrest is a clear, issue that many of our patients have had to endure. But even things like natural disasters that displace entire villages and communities, like that becomes a stressor. So what Lauren's team is trying to do is make sure that we tailor our data around who the people are, which is something that we don't typically do as geneticists. Right? As epidemiologists, even, it's easier to have an area level approach where you can use the same metric across the board. Statistically speaking, it's easier to do that type of analysis. But we're going to dig in and really make this people-centered, is what our patient group calls it, people-centered research, so that we can start seeing what are some of these, shared experiences and shared exposures that we don't fully understand.
Well, I'm particularly interested in the existence of admixture because we, in this discussion, we hear a lot about Nigeria, we hear a lot about Ghana, but Côte d'Ivoire sits right here. You talked about admixture. Côte d'Ivoire sits right here. And I'm just curious, you talked about Italy versus France. And so I'm just curious, and we'll talk about that some other time, if there are differences in those populations versus looking at Ghana and Nigeria and Benin and those other places in that area. So that is so critically important, and you bring us to a place, and that is knowing our history biological, our genetic history, what our predispositions may be. And I will say that that's why family reunions and
Yeah.
the gatherings of family are so very important. So we get to find out that what Uncle Bob had was not what we thought he had.
Right.
And then that gives us a lens into better understanding what our opportunity may be. Now, precision medicine, Dr. Davis, and we are learning to ask for those treatments and therapies as well, I guess, that will help us improve our outcomes. Tell us about the engagement of your work in precision medicine.
Well, one of the things we try to make sure that the data we're generating will help us do is, of course, improve precision medicine. So, for instance, let's take an example of what precision medicine looks like, right? So, mutation panel testing. So if you have a certain type of cancer diagnosis, there might be a targeted therapy that has been proven to be very effective, right? You only need a certain number of rounds. I don't have the words of the type of drugs right now on top of mind, but the way we match patients to drugs typically is by what we call a biomarker, right? So sometimes those biomarkers are not well defined in our population. So that mutation panel test I just mentioned. So it'll be anywhere between 3 to 25 genes that the pathologist is going to determine if this patient has a mutation in one of these genes, right? If they do, then that means there's a certain profile that the tumor has, a certain biological profile that would make that patient eligible for that targeted therapy. What we find from those mutation panel tests is that if you're of non-European ancestry, I know I sound like a broken record.
That's okay.
But if you're of non-European genetic ancestry, then you might have a mutation in these genes, but it's going to be more likely a variant of unknown significance. That's what the report says, of unknown significance, meaning we've never seen this mutation in our knowledge base. So the knowledge base is based on what we call genome-wide association studies, which have been biased with predominantly, 95% European, or European origin people. Said another way, less than 3% represent 80% of the world in these knowledge bases. And so then this variant of unknown significance is by definition inactionable unless we change policies. So we have seen a shift where any type of mutation now is acceptable to make a patient eligible for certain types of therapies. But what we want to do is identify new genes that should be on that panel, right? So there are other DNA repair genes that aren't currently on that list of cancer genes because the variants that are lending predisposition to these types of tumors have not been a part of those GWAS studies. They're what the field may call rare variants because they've rarely seen them. But in an African population, it might be a predominant mutation in those cancer patients, but we've just not interrogated them. So that's one aspect of how we'll improve precision medicine. Number one, by removing these unknown labels and make them known, right? So having companion data that support that this mutation leads to is the driver that led to the tumor being malignant is one of the aspects. But another is by simply identifying new cancer genes. But we also have a team that's really interested in identifying drugs that target certain immune profiles, right? So one of our team members, Dr. Clayton Yates, is developing a drug target that focuses on what we call M2 macrophages, which appears to be more prevalent, for instance, in some of our prostate cancer patients who are African American and of West African descent. So we have sort of this two-prong approach with precision medicine, identifying and discovering new genes, but more importantly, for the reports that we already have, let's make them known in terms of how significant they are in our population.
So you've been listening and watching Dr. Melissa Davis, and Dr. Davis is at Morehouse School of Medicine. She is the director of the Institute of Translational Genomics. She's also involved with the Georgia Research Alliance as a distinguished investigator. In our final segment, Dr. Davis, we've worked with the Undiagnosed Disease Network across the country, and we're going to end to talk about opportunities for people to enter into the career that you've undertaken, and where are those opportunities as a geneticist? There's a title, I've been trying to think about it. I couldn't remember it when we talk about genetic testing, those genetic researchers. Tell us about how one like a Melissa Davis gets involved in genetics, and what would you recommend for someone who may think that they're interested in understanding how we got to where we are based on where we came from, our genetic predisposition?
So I can tell you my path, and then maybe we can build around that.
Okay.
When I was an undergraduate at Albany State, I knew I wanted to be in some field of science because that seemed to be, where both my skill, my talent, was, but also my interest, But I wasn't aware of genetics as a field until I undertook a research opportunity at The Ohio State University. It was a summer research program. To be honest, the only reason I did it was because they were going to pay me a stipend and it was going to allow me to get a car, And so I was like, sure, I'll go. But then when I went and I saw for the first time that there were people who just went into a lab every day and did experiments, and that was their job. I had no idea that lifestyle even existed from Albany, Georgia. So the first step is to expand your scope. You need to make sure that you take opportunities as they come in order to step outside of where you sort of are homegrown, right? Just widen your lens, first of all, and take experiences that might not seem like something you would typically do, just to have the experience of something different. Because you may find that experience solidifies a no, quite frankly, for you. Like, I know I don't want to do that. But even just going through that process is going to widen your scope of thinking. The second thing that I think was really instrumental in me coming down this path was having mentors around me. And many of them came in the form of my professors at school. My mother was a high school science teacher, so I was always unafraid of science, But sometimes we don't know where our mentors are, and that can be quite challenging. And so, but there are organizations that exist for the purpose of identifying networks of individuals for you to, at the very least, have conversations with and then start building a rapport. Now, the reason why I knew to go down this track of having a graduate degree, for instance, versus a medical degree was more of preference. I didn't want to, initially I thought I wanted to see patients and treat patients. But once I had that research experience and my professor said to me, at this moment, we are the only two people on the planet that know that fibronectin 12 is involved in neurospinal regeneration. I was like, wow, did we just, cure paralysis? And he was like, no, not yet. But this is a key factor in how we'll treat patients. And I don't know, that spark was just like, wow, we just discovered something that is going to change the world. And that sort of spark in me is what I continuously chase, and I think that it takes a special person to want that for themselves, but want it for the world, and also be able to navigate some of the hardships that you're going to endure in any academic climb, quite frankly. But then the last piece of advice I would give is, if you think that science is really what you want to do, then you have to be a lifelong learner. You also have to have some type of intuition, I'll call it, but more just the impetus to move beyond the knowledge barriers that might be around you. So, no, you might not have the best edition of a textbook, but quite frankly, in this version of the world that we live in right now, and I tell my children this, quite frankly, like, you have at your disposal, all human knowledge in the palm of your hand. What are you going to do with that? What are you going to teach yourself? What are you going to learn? And then what are you going to add to it? I think one of the key aspects of graduate training is knowing that you have to discover something that no one else knows about in that sort of thesis writing and, experimentation journey. But you can do that without being in a PhD, program. You just have to be inquisitive enough to want to be a lifelong learner. And as you see opportunities to participate in research, take them as often as you can.
Well, Dr. Davis, we haven't finished this conversation, so we have to have you back so we can finish this.
Yeah.
You've been listening and enjoying Dr. Melissa Davis at Morehouse School of Medicine. We've learned a lot about genetics, about where we came from, but most of all, where we're going from a transformative perspective. We need a lot of transformation. We want to take cue from Dr. Davis, and that is surround yourself with people who love you, people who care about you, and people who support you. Look for mentors. Ask them what it is they have to offer you as a mentor. You're not just seeking a mentor, but you need to be sure that what you're seeking is what they're offering. So from One Joshua Group and LifeBeat, we'll remind you to be kind to yourself, to be kind to each other, and to thank Dr. Davis for coming. We'll see you on the next podcast.
Thank you.
We would love to hear from you. Send your listener letters, questions, and topic requests to media@the1jg.com. LifeBeat, the podcast, is sponsored by One Joshua Group, your strategic source for engagement to improve life through better health, education, and information. To learn more, visit us at the1jg.com or follow our work on social media using #OneJGCollabs. One Joshua Group, advancing access to healthcare and education by joining what you know with what we've learned.